Sophia is your mother. The contractor just quoted us $6,000 for the marine-grade vinyl on the boat seats. Your father is furious. I know you asked to borrow $50 for groceries this week, but we are stretched incredibly thin right now. Work an extra shift if you have to. We all have to make sacrifices. My name is Sophia Jones. I am 31 years old. I live in Sacramento, California. I listened to that voicemail on a Tuesday morning while driving my 2010 Honda down Interstate 5. A jagged crack ran down the center of my windshield, catching the glare of the early sun. I was on my way to my second job. For 8 years, I had worked 60-hour weeks as a clinical data manager, trying to outrun a student loan balance that sat at $140,000. My minimum monthly payment was $1,450. I bought my clothes at thrift stores. I skipped meals. I lived in a state of constant gnawing panic. My parents, Richard and Diane, split their time between a manicured suburban estate and a waterfront vacation home in Lake Tahoe. Whenever I cried about the crushing weight of my payments, they offered the same rehearsed response. It is the price of a good education, Sophia. Do not play the victim. But the thick manila envelope sitting on my passenger seat told a different story. The return address read, United States Department of Education, Office of the Inspector General. I pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder of the highway. The engine idled rough. My hands shook as I broke the seal. It was not a standard bill. It was a formal notification of a forensic audit. The government had flagged a series of unauthorized routing numbers attached to my private and federal loan disbursements. I scanned the lines of text. The numbers blurred and then sharpened. According to the federal government, $85,000 of my undergraduate loans had never been sent to my university. The money had been wired directly into a regional bank joint checking account, an account I did not open and could not access. My parents did not just refuse to help me pay for college, they had secretly used the credit I qualified for to fund the down payment on their second home. Before I tell you about the federal deposition that dismantled my family and the paper trail that proved everything, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Elena Vengeance. If you have a second, drop a comment. Tell me where you are listening from and how old you are. It helps this channel grow. Now let me take you back to the beginning. To understand how a six-figure financial crime happens inside a family, you have to look at how the trap was built. 13 years ago, I was an 18-year-old high school senior with a 3.9 GPA. I sat at my parents' glass dining table staring at a stack of financial aid forms. I wanted to attend a state university in Southern California. Richard sat across from me, wearing his standard corporate suit. He slid a pen across the glass. Richard held a silver fountain pen out to me. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a crisp white shirt. He did not look like a man orchestrating a financial crime against his own daughter. He looked like a mid-level corporate executive managing a minor logistical hurdle. That was his gift. He could wrap betrayal in the language of administrative efficiency. We make too much money for you to qualify for federal Pell Grants, Sophia, he said, leaning back in his leather dining chair. But we have a strategy. I will handle the master promissory notes for the private loans. You just need to sign here and here. I was 18 years old. I knew how to diagram a cellular structure for AP biology, but I knew nothing about compounding interest or loan disbursement schedules. I looked down at the dense stacks of paper spread across the glass table. I trusted the man sitting across from me because that is what children are programmed to do. I took the silver pen. I signed my name on the lines he pointed to. I did not read the fine print. Mixed into the pile of university enrollment forms and standard financial aid documents was a separate packet. Richard tapped the top page. "This is a power of attorney," he said casually. "Do not let the legal title scare you. It is strictly for our accountant. It allows me to handle the tax filings and optimize our family bracket while you are away at school. It means we can afford to help you more." It sounded like protection. It was actually the key to the vault. I signed that document too. I did not know that a broad power of attorney gave Richard the legal authority to open joint checking accounts in my name without my physical presence or verbal consent. Then Diane walked into the dining room. My mother treated home decor like a competitive sport, and her appearance was just as carefully curated. She set a mug of herbal tea on the table and brought up my cell phone. I had offered to switch to my own carrier using the money I saved from my high school retail job. Diane waved her hand, dismissing the idea instantly. "Do not be ridiculous," she said. "Stay on the family cell phone plan. You are going to be a broke college student. Save your pennies. We will cover the line." Again, it sounded like maternal generosity, a small financial cushion to ease my transition into adulthood. Looking back, the calculation was breathtaking. Modern private student loans and banking institutions require strict identity verification. They send two-factor authentication codes via text message. They send account recovery links to the primary phone number on file. By insisting I remain on the family plan, Diane ensured the administrative contact number for my financial profile routed directly to a secondary phone she kept in her home office desk. Every approval text, every disbursement alert, every fraud warning went to a screen I never saw. They built a soundproof wall around my digital identity. 2 months later, I moved to Southern California. I carried boxes into a cramped dorm room, feeling the thrill of independence. That thrill evaporated by the third week of classes. The loans I signed at the glass dining table were supposed to cover tuition, housing, and a generous stipend for books and living expenses. But when I checked my student portal, the balance showed only enough to cover the bare minimum of my classes. There was no stipend. The housing account was dangerously low. I assumed I had misunderstood the cost of higher education. I assumed the loans were just smaller than I thought. I had no idea that the surplus funds had been quietly diverted into a regional bank account located 300 miles away in Sacramento. The reality of my engineered poverty hit me during midterm season. I needed a specialized software access code for my chemistry lab. It cost $120. Without it, I would fail the module. I walked into the campus bookstore. The air smelled of fresh cardboard and floor wax. The line at the register was long, filled with students holding items and swiping their parents' credit cards without a second thought. I stepped up to the counter. I handed the cashier the software card. I swiped my debit card. The machine beeped a sharp, flat tone. Declined. The cashier, a student a year older than me, sighed and pressed a button on her screen. Try it again. I swiped again. The same flat tone. Declined. The heat rose in my neck. I could feel the eyes of the students waiting behind me. I checked my banking app on my phone. My available balance was $14. I apologized, quietly stepped out of the line, and walked out of the store empty-handed. I sat on a concrete bench near the student union. The California sun was bright, but my hands were freezing. I dialed my mother. I listened to the phone ring, picturing her in our pristine Sacramento kitchen. She answered on the third ring. I could hear the faint sound of a television in the background. I explained the situation. I kept my voice low so the passing students would not hear. I explained the chemistry module, the access code, the empty bank account. I asked if they could transfer a small amount just to get me through the week. Diane did not sound worried. Her voice dropped into a tone of profound disappointment, the tone she used when someone scuffed her hardwood floors. "Welcome to the real world, Sophia," she said. Her articulation was sharp. "We provided the foundation for you to go to school. We handled the heavy lifting. You need to figure out the rest. Work harder. Stop expecting handouts." She ended the call. The dial tone hummed in my ear. That conversation was the cornerstone of their psychological conditioning. They needed me to believe my financial struggle was a personal, moral failure. If I felt ashamed of my poverty, I would not ask questions. I would not ask to see the original loan documents. I would just put my head down and accept the burden. The conditioning worked flawlessly. I walked straight from that concrete bench to a campus coffee shop and applied for a job. I was hired the next day. For the next 3 years, I worked 35 hours a week. I woke up at 4 in the morning to open the cafe. I steamed milk and scrubbed espresso machines. I smelled like roasted beans and industrial sanitizer. I studied my biology textbooks in the break room while eating discounted pastries because I could not afford groceries. When the coffee shop shifts were not enough to cover my lab fees, I found another way. Twice a month, I took a bus to a plasma donation center off campus. I sat in a cold, sterile room with a thick needle in my vein, watching the centrifuge hum and separate my blood. It took an hour and a half. They handed me a prepaid debit card loaded with $40 each time. I used that card to buy generic brand rice canned beans and used textbooks. I endured this grueling existence believing it was the normal price of ambition. I thought every student who was not born rich suffered like this. I did not know that while I was sitting in a plastic chair, squeezing a foam ball to pump blood out of my arm, my signature was securing another line of credit. I stopped calling my parents for help. I stopped calling them for emotional support. I became a ghost in my own life, channeling all my energy into basic survival. The distance between us grew, but Richard and Diane did not seem to mind. They preferred the silence. Silence meant the machinery of their theft was operating without friction. But hiding a crime of that magnitude requires discipline. It requires the perpetrators to remain modest, and my parents were incapable of modesty. The illusion they built around me was functional, but their vanity was about to override their caution. They were preparing to make a purchase so bold, so visually undeniable, that the math of my suffering would no longer add up. The campus emptied out by the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The brick pathways, usually crowded with students rushing to lectures, became silent and hollow. I stayed behind. My bank account balance hovered around $32. That was not enough to fill the gas tank of my aging Honda, let alone buy a bus ticket back to Sacramento. Instead of sitting at a family dinner table, I volunteered for a double shift at the coffee shop. Holiday shifts were grueling. The customers who did come in were usually stressed travelers or locals demanding complex seasonal drinks. By 2 in the afternoon, my lower back throbbed. My hands smelled of bleached sanitizer and scalded milk. I wiped down the espresso machines with a damp rag, watching the clock inch forward. My manager granted me a 15-minute break. I retreated to the storage room and sat on an overturned plastic milk crate. The air in there was thick with the scent of roasted beans and cardboard boxes. I pulled out my phone to distract myself from the ache in my feet. I opened a social media app and scrolled aimlessly. That is when I saw it. My mother had uploaded a digital album featuring 42 high-resolution photographs. The caption read, "Our new Tahoe paradise," in bright, cheerful letters. I stopped breathing. I tapped the first image. It was a sprawling 4-bedroom waterfront property. The exterior featured dark-stained cedar siding and expansive glass windows reflecting the pristine blue water of the lake. A wraparound wooden deck stretched toward a private dock. I swiped to the next photo. The living room boasted vaulted ceilings with exposed timber beams and a massive stone fireplace. Then I swiped to the kitchen. The center of the room was dominated by a custom Italian marble island. The stone was a brilliant, stark white, laced with intricate veins of deep charcoal gray. It looked heavy, cold, and undeniably expensive. Diane stood behind the island wearing a cashmere sweater, holding a crystal wine glass. She smiled at the camera, projecting the image of a woman who had conquered the world. A strange ringing sound started in my ears. I sat in a dingy storage room, wearing an apron stained with caramel syrup. For dinner that night, I planned to boil a 50-cent packet of instant ramen noodles, using the hot water tap from the espresso machine. Meanwhile, my parents had just purchased a luxury vacation home in one of the most exclusive zip codes in California. I stood up. I walked out the back door of the coffee shop into the narrow concrete alley. The November air was sharp and biting. I dialed my father's number. Richard answered on the second ring. I could hear the faint sound of acoustic guitar music and the clinking of silverware in the background. "Hello, Sophia," he said. His voice was relaxed, echoing slightly in what sounded like a very large room. "Are you in Tahoe?" I asked. My voice trembled, but I fought to keep it steady. "We are," he replied easily. "We closed on the property last week. We wanted to get the keys before the holiday weekend. It is a beautiful spot. You should come up and see it sometime when you are not so busy." "How did you afford a second mortgage?" I asked. The question breached the unspoken boundary of our family dynamic. Children were not supposed to interrogate the architects of the household. Richard paused. The warmth vanished from his tone, replaced by a practiced corporate chill. "That is a rather invasive question, Sophia," he said. "I am eating instant soup for Thanksgiving dinner," I replied. "I cannot afford the access code for my biology lab." "You told me the family was stretched incredibly thin. You said I needed to take out maximum student loans because there was no extra cash. Now you own a lake house. How does that math work?" His sigh transmitted clearly through the receiver. It was the sound of a man dealing with an unreasonable subordinate. "We have a highly aggressive investment portfolio," he explained using the jargon he wielded during board meetings. "We diversified our assets. Real estate is a hedge against inflation. This purchase has nothing to do with your collegiate expenses. Your mother and I worked hard for decades to build our equity. Do not let envy cloud your judgment. It is an ugly trait." He hung up before I could respond. I stood in the alley, staring at the brick wall opposite the door. I felt a deep, suffocating wave of shame. He had masterfully flipped the narrative. I was not a struggling student asking a logical question. I was an ungrateful, envious child trying to ruin their hard-earned success. I went back inside, tied my apron tighter, and finished my shift. It would take nearly a decade for the truth to surface. Years later, when the federal investigators finally handed me the banking ledgers, the reality of that phone call would make me physically sick. The math Richard defended with such arrogant confidence was a lie. The ledger documented everything in chronological order. On November 15th of my sophomore year, my private loan provider dispersed a check for $22,000. That money dropped directly into the joint account I never knew existed. 3 days later, on November 18th, a wire transfer originated from that exact same account. The destination was a premium stone and tile contractor based in Placer County. The amount was exactly $18,000. The down payment for that specific Italian marble island came directly from my approved credit. The juxtaposition is still difficult to process. Twice a month, I sat in a sterile clinic letting a machine pull blood plasma from my veins. I traded my physical health for a $40 prepaid card just to buy generic groceries and pay for mandatory lab fees. My mother used the compounding interest attached to my Social Security number to run her manicured hands over imported luxury stone. That marble island became the physical symbol of my betrayal. It was cold-polished and immovable. It stood in the center of their vacation home, serving as a monument to their vanity. They entertained guests around that stone. They served imported cheeses and expensive wines on a surface purchased with my future financial ruin. At the time, the financial disparity was mathematically impossible. A mid-level manager and a homemaker should not have possessed the liquid capital to acquire a waterfront property in Tahoe without severe leveraging. But I was simply too exhausted to see the truth right in front of me. Fatigue creates terrible blind spots. When you are focused entirely on surviving the next 24 hours, you lack the energy to investigate the structural integrity of your own life. I accepted the lie. I believed my father was a financial genius, and I was just a struggling young adult learning the harsh lessons of independence. I pushed the resentment down and continued working my double shifts. But the Tahoe house was only one aspect of their engineered reality. Real estate is a static asset. It sits quietly by the water. The true insult, the living, breathing monument to their deception, was about to enter the picture. The conflict rarely stays contained to real estate and bank ledgers. It eventually requires an audience. It requires a beneficiary to flaunt the stolen wealth. While I was scrubbing espresso machines and rationing instant noodles, someone else was preparing to reap the rewards of my forged signature. My younger brother was getting ready to start his own college journey, and the rules of the game were about to change drastically. Conflict in a toxic household rarely stays contained to the architects of the dysfunction. It bleeds outward, seeking new vessels to infect. My younger brother, Trevor, is 4 years my junior. Growing up, he occupied a parallel reality within the same four walls. If I served as the dependable scapegoat designed to bear the structural weight of the family, Trevor was the prized exhibit meant to be displayed. He never held a part-time job during high school. He spent his summers attending elite tennis camps and traveling with affluent friends. When it came time for him to pursue higher education, the rules of our universe flipped entirely. He did not apply to local state colleges. He set his sights on a private, out-of-state university with a staggering tuition rate. I assumed my parents would deliver the same stern kitchen table lecture they gave me. I expected them to slide a thick stack of promissory notes across the glass and tell him to figure out the logistics of his own survival. That lecture never materialized. Instead, he moved into a newly constructed off-campus high-rise, boasting a rooftop pool and concierge service. He drove a pristine Jeep Wrangler. I was still riding the early morning city bus, smelling like stale espresso and industrial bleach. Upon earning my degree, I needed to transition into the adult workforce. I required reliable transportation and a place to live near my new clinical data management job. Securing a residential lease or an auto loan mandates a comprehensive background check. A standard inquiry by a landlord or a dealership would have instantly revealed the towering six-figure balance attached to my Social Security number. Richard understood this vulnerability. He knew that a routine credit pull would expose the forged documents. He engineered a brilliant solution to keep me blind. Before I could even submit a rental application, Richard called me. He adopted the soothing tone of a benevolent patriarch, offering crucial fiscal wisdom. "You have a nascent borrowing history, Sophia," he told me. "Landlords are predatory in this market. Dealerships will lock you into predatory interest rates because you lack a proven track record. Let me co-sign your lease. Let me put the vehicle financing under my umbrella. We will build your score safely over time without exposing you to unnecessary risk." It felt like a rare moment of parental protection. I thanked him profusely. I signed the paperwork for a damp basement unit that smelled of mildew and a dented, decade-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield. By shielding my identity from external inquiries, Richard effectively quarantined me from my own truth. I remained isolated in the dark, grateful for the cage he built around me. The illusion held firm for years. It crystallized perfectly during a winter holiday gathering at the Tahoe property. I was 24. Trevor had recently married Jessica. She was an Orange County native who built a lucrative career as a boutique Pilates instructor. She possessed the kind of effortless blonde polish that requires immense generational wealth to maintain. She wore silk loungewear and diamond stud earrings, while I sat across from her wearing a wool sweater I purchased for $4 at a local charity shop. The dining table sat adjacent to the imported stone island. The room smelled of roasted pine and expensive Cabernet. I felt acutely out of place. My contribution to the gift exchange sat under the decorated tree. I had wrapped 2 discounted ceramic mugs for the newlyweds. I spent weeks agonizing over the purchase, calculating how many extra medical charts I needed to audit to afford them. Halfway through the meal, Jessica swirled the dark red wine in her crystal glass. She fixed her gaze on me. Her expression held a strange mixture of pity and genuine awe. "Sophia, your generosity toward Trevor's education is just so inspiring," she said. Her voice carried over the quiet hum of the room. "We were looking at his accounts the other day, and the support you provide is incredible. I do not know many sisters who would sacrifice so much." The temperature in my chest spiked. I stared down at my plate, focusing on the intricate pattern of the porcelain edge. I interpreted her words through the lens of my own deep-seated inadequacy. I thought she was delivering a veiled, cruel insult regarding my thrift store gifts. I assumed she found my cheap ceramic mugs pathetic compared to the lavish presents surrounding the tree. I mumbled a brief deflection and excused myself to the kitchen, pretending to fetch more water. I spent the remainder of the evening avoiding her gaze, ashamed of my own poverty. I did not understand the gravity of her statement. Jessica lacked the cunning required for sarcasm. She was an oblivious beneficiary reciting the narrative she had been fed. She and Trevor operated under the assumption that I was a willing, active sponsor of their luxury lifestyle. They believed my threadbare sweaters and dented car were the result of my noble choice to fund his private tuition. They had no idea I was a victim of identity theft. They did not know the funds keeping Trevor in his rooftop apartment were siphoned through forged signatures bearing my name. The psychological damage of that dinner lingered long after the snow melted in Tahoe. I returned to my basement unit feeling smaller and more defective than ever. I doubled down on my extreme frugality. I tracked every penny I earned. I stopped buying new clothes. I ate generic canned goods. I channeled all my energy into surviving the invisible weight pressing down on my chest. But the walls of Richard's careful quarantine were bound to crack. The university grace period possesses a strict expiration date. A lender expects a return on their investment, and administrative delays only last so long. The protective bubble burst a few months later when the Postal Service delivered a thick envelope bearing my name. Inside that envelope lay a set of numbers that would force me to question my own sanity and push my father to execute his most brazen deception yet. 6 months after my 24th birthday, the administrative grace period reached its expiration. The leniency granted to recent graduates vanished, and the financial reality of my supposed education materialized in a standard white envelope. I retrieved the mail from the rusted metal box outside my basement apartment. The air felt heavy with the threat of incoming rain. The return address bore the logo of a national loan servicing conglomerate. I carried the sealed letter down the concrete steps. My unit smelled faintly of mildew and old dust. I sat at a chipped laminate desk in the corner of the main room and slid my thumbnail under the paper flap. I unfolded the consolidated statement. The bold black typography at the top of the page delivered the final calculation. My total outstanding balance stood at $140,000. Below that figure rested the monthly minimum due, $1,450. I stopped breathing. The hum of the aging refrigerator in the kitchenette seemed to amplify, filling the cramped space. I pressed my fingertips against my temples. The math cascaded through my mind. My entry-level salary as a clinical data manager provided a modest living. After accounting for state taxes, health insurance, rent, and basic utilities, the remainder of my paycheck fell short of that minimum payment requirement. I did not possess the capital to cover the debt, let alone buy groceries or put fuel in my cracked vehicle. Panic induces a specific physiological response. The chest tightens, the peripheral vision narrows. I did not cry. I opened my laptop. I channeled my professional training into my personal disaster. My career revolved around building meticulous grids tracking patient outcomes and identifying statistical anomalies. I applied those exact skills to my own survival. I created a blank spreadsheet. I stripped my existence down to the studs. I deleted every non-essential expense. I canceled my internet service, relying instead on the unsecured network from the cafe across the street. I limited my grocery budget to $35 a week, sustaining myself on bulk rice, discounted dried beans, and dented canned goods. I stopped accepting social invitations. When colleagues invited me out for Friday evening drinks, I fabricated scheduling conflicts. I became a ghost, haunting my own life. To bridge the financial gap, I secured a secondary weekend position auditing medical charts for an urgent care clinic. I sat in my cold apartment for 14 hours every Saturday and Sunday, staring at a glaring monitor, processing insurance codes until my eyes burned. Every cent I earned funneled directly into the servicer portal. I lived in a state of indentured servitude, dedicating my youth to a ledger I could never conquer. Winter arrived, bringing the annual tax season. The clinic break room buzzed with conversations about refunds and filing strategies. A senior nurse poured coffee and mentioned the 1098E tax form. She explained that individuals paying off educational debt could deduct the accumulated interest from their taxable income. I calculated my contributions from the previous 12 months. I had surrendered nearly $17,000. A significant portion of that consisted of pure interest. Claiming that deduction would trigger a modest return. It represented enough capital to repair the jagged crack in my windshield or purchase proper winter footwear. That evening, I logged into the borrower portal. I navigated to the tax documents section. The screen displayed a locked icon. A notification stated the required forms had already been generated and routed to the primary administrative email on file. The email address belonged to Richard. I stepped out into the freezing evening air and pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I dialed his number. He answered with the polished greeting he reserved for clients and subordinates. I asked for the document. I explained the deduction, keeping my tone level and professional. I outlined how the small refund would provide a crucial buffer for my rigid budget. The silence on the line stretched for 3 agonizing seconds. When Richard spoke, his cadence had shifted. The corporate warmth vanished, replaced by a rigid, calculated reprimand. "We cannot provide that form, Sophia," he said. "Our accountant requires it to maximize the household return." I stood on the cracked asphalt, shivering. I pointed out that I made the payments using my own wages. I earned the deduction through my own labor. His sigh echoed through the speaker. It was a masterclass in engineered disappointment. "You need to look at the bigger picture," he scolded. "Who co-signed your residential lease? Who leveraged their pristine borrowing history to secure your vehicle financing? We absorb a tremendous amount of risk keeping a roof over your head. We claim you as a fiscal dependent to offset that ongoing liability. Diverting that form for a minor personal refund would disrupt our entire strategy. Do not be selfish." The accusation struck my chest like a physical blow. Selfish. I worked 70 hours a week. I wore boots with worn soles that let the rainwater seep through to my socks. I ate plain rice while he planned his next ski trip to the Tahoe property. Yet he possessed the singular ability to twist reality until I felt like a burden draining his resources. I lacked the knowledge of federal tax law to argue. I did not know that a parent cannot legally claim a 24-year-old non-student earning an independent income as a dependent. Nor did I realize the devastating truth hidden beneath his reprimand. Richard was not merely shielding me from a credit check. He was actively stealing my tax return. He utilized the exorbitant interest generated by my forged signature to artificially lower his executive tax bracket, cheating the government while I starved. I accepted his lie. I apologized for asking. I ended the call and walked back down the concrete steps into my basement. The psychological toll of that exchange fundamentally altered my internal landscape. If my own father viewed my struggle as a burden, I determined I must be the architect of my own failure. I convinced myself I was financially illiterate. I assumed the towering debt resulted from my failure to understand the capitalization of interest rates during my collegiate years. I believed a standard state school tuition naturally ballooned into six figures, and my inability to handle it highlighted my own incompetence. The following morning, I walked to a local office supply store. I purchased a single green manila folder. I printed out the consolidated loan statement detailing the staggering sum. I slid the paper inside the thick green cardstock. I placed the folder in the bottom drawer of my laminate desk. I built thick scar tissue over my resentment. I severed my emotional reliance on my family entirely. I stopped sharing details about my career. I stopped asking for advice. I stopped visiting for holidays, citing my weekend audit shifts as the perpetual excuse. I functioned as an isolated machine, processing data, paying bills, and sleeping. The green folder sat in the darkness of that desk drawer. It functioned as a silent, ticking clock. I let it rest there, accumulating hidden statements and silent ledgers. I endured this Spartan lifestyle for 4 consecutive years. I poured every ounce of my discipline into scraping together a minuscule savings reserve hidden in a separate local credit union. I dreamed of purchasing a tiny piece of real estate, something small, secure, and entirely my own. I set my sights on a 600-square-foot condominium located on the outskirts of the city. To achieve this modest goal, I needed to sit down with a professional mortgage broker. I did not anticipate that stepping into a lender's office would finally break the quarantine my father constructed. I did not know the broker was about to pull the curtain back on a decade of systematic fraud. The meticulous record-keeping I developed to survive their trap was about to become the weapon that would dismantle their entire curated empire. The miserable endurance of my 20s stretched forward. I reached 28 years old, living a life defined entirely by subtraction. I subtracted meals. I subtracted heating bills. I subtracted any semblance of leisure. Over those 6 agonizing years, I scraped together a savings reserve inch by inch. It sat in a secure credit union far from my father's financial influence. The total reached just enough to cover a 5% down payment on a microscopic piece of real estate. I found a property on the industrial edge of Sacramento. It measured exactly 600 square feet. The unit lacked a dishwasher, and the laminate floors were peeling at the corners, but it possessed a southern-facing window that let in the morning light. More importantly, it represented a sanctuary. It was a fortress where no one could scold me for my poverty. I scheduled an appointment with a local mortgage broker named Helen to secure the financing. Helen possessed decades of experience in the real estate sector. Her office sat on the second floor of a brick building, smelling of brewed dark roast coffee and citrus cleaning solvent. She wore sharp reading glasses on a silver chain and projected an aura of quiet competence. I handed her my pay stubs, my tax returns, and my credit union statements. I sat in the leather guest chair, folding my hands in my lap. I expected a difficult conversation regarding my debt-to-income ratio. I knew the student loan burden was a heavy anchor. Helen typed my Social Security number into her dual monitor setup. She hit the return key. The silence in the room stretched. She did not nod. She did not offer a reassuring smile. She pulled off her reading glasses and let them drop against her chest. She turned the right monitor toward me. "Sophia, we need to have a serious conversation," she said. Her tone was careful, measured. "Your debt-to-income ratio is unworkable for this mortgage. I anticipated that based on your intake forms, but the underlying data presents a severe anomaly." I leaned forward. The screen displayed rows of digital text. I recognized the federal loan sums and the initial private disbursements from my freshman and sophomore years. "Look right here," Helen instructed, pointing a manicured fingernail at the lower quadrant of the screen. "I do not understand the origin dates on these 3 specific liabilities." I squinted at the screen. The text detailed 3 separate maximum limit private promissory notes. The sums were staggering. My lungs ceased pulling oxygen. The origination dates listed next to the figures did not align with my university enrollment. The first note opened when I was 23. The second appeared when I was 24. The third originated just after my 25th birthday. I graduated at 22, I whispered. Helen leaned back in her chair. That is why I am concerned, Sophia. You hold 3 active promissory notes originated after your diploma was printed. The disbursements did not route to a bursar office. The funds funneled directly into a regional financial institution right here in the valley. Do you recognize this routing number? She highlighted a string of 9 digits. I stared at the numbers. The room tilted slightly. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I shook my head. I recommend you investigate this immediately, Helen said. Her professional detachment faded, replaced by genuine alarm. If you did not authorize these lines of credit, you have a critical security breach. I drove home in silence. The cracked windshield of my Honda distorted the oncoming traffic lights. I did not sleep that night. I paced the narrow floor of my basement apartment, tracking the timeline in my head. At 23, I was working double shifts at the coffee shop and donating plasma. At 24, I was rationing canned beans and begging my father for a tax form. At 25, I was auditing medical charts on weekends just to meet the minimum payments. During those exact same years, someone was using my identity to harvest tens of thousands of dollars in fresh capital. At 8:55 the next morning, I stood on the concrete sidewalk outside the regional bank branch Helen had identified. I waited for the security guard to unlock the heavy glass doors. I was the first customer inside. I approached the polished mahogany counter. The teller greeted me with a rehearsed smile. I placed my California driver license on the counter. I need the transaction records for all accounts linked to this identity, I said. My voice was hollow, devoid of any inflection. The teller swiped my license through his keyboard reader. He typed a few commands. His smile faltered. He stared at his screen, then looked up at me. He excused himself and walked to a glass-enclosed office in the back. A branch manager emerged carrying a thick stack of paper fresh from the printer. She invited me into her office and closed the door. She handed me the documents. Here are the ledgers for your joint checking account, she stated. I did not reach for the papers immediately. I focused on her words. Joint account. Who is the secondary signer, I asked. The manager tapped the top page. Your mother, Diane Jones. The account was established 13 years ago. The power of attorney. The document Richard slipped into the pile of financial aid forms at the glass dining table. It provided the legal foundation for Diane to link her name to my identity. By keeping me on the family cellular plan, she intercepted every digital alert, every fraud warning, every security verification protocol. They built a shadow economy using my name as the collateral. I took the stack of papers. There were 50 pages. I walked out of the bank. I did not go to work. I sat in the driver's seat of my car in the parking lot. I turned off the engine and laid the ledger across the steering wheel. I read the history line by line. The deposits consisted of massive lump sum wire transfers from the private student loan providers. The withdrawals painted a vivid, excruciating portrait of a lifestyle I was funding but never allowed to experience. A payment of $4,200 routed to the Placer County tax assessor. They were paying the annual property taxes for the Tahoe vacation home using my forged credit. A transaction for $1,800 at an upscale marine sports facility, jet ski rentals. The date matched the weekend Trevor and Jessica took a summer trip to the lake. $3,000 sent to an exterior design firm, wicker and teak outdoor patio furnishings. I traced a specific charge for imported wine and artisanal catering back to the exact Thanksgiving weekend when I was working a double shift, rationing instant soup in a dingy storage room. The paradigm of my entire existence shattered inside that rusted Honda. The conflict evolved in a matter of seconds. For a decade, I believed I was the victim of parental neglect and my own financial incompetence. I thought my family simply lacked empathy. I was wrong. This was not neglect. This was an active, documentable felony. My parents were not merely unsupportive. They were predators. They harvested my future to finance their vanity. I drove back to my basement apartment. I opened the bottom drawer of my laminate desk. I pulled out the green manila folder. The object that had served as the tomb for my shame, the silent record of my failure, now required a new purpose. I placed the 50 pages of bank statements inside the thick cardstock. The folder expanded. It felt heavy in my hands. It was no longer a symbol of my defeat. It was a dossier. I closed the desk drawer. The psychological conditioning Richard and Diane spent 13 years building vanished. I no longer felt the crushing weight of inadequacy. I felt the cold, clinical clarity of a medical auditor holding the irrefutable evidence of a fatal error. The infrastructure of their control was broken. The invisible war they waged against me was now visible. I picked up the green folder and my car keys. I walked out the door and started the engine. The time for silent endurance was over. I steered the car toward the affluent suburbs. I was going to place the evidence directly on the table where the trap was originally set. The illusion required a confrontation. The drive from my industrial neighborhood to the affluent, gated community where my parents resided took 45 minutes. I navigated the rusted Honda through streets lined with towering oak trees and manicured lawns. The estates in this zip code featured sweeping driveways and custom iron gates. The wealth on display felt heavy, tangible, and entirely insulated from the consequences of the outside world. I pulled into the circular driveway of my childhood home. The tires crunched over the pristine gravel. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment. I rested my hand on the green manila folder sitting on the passenger seat. For 13 years, I approached this house with a sense of lingering guilt and financial inadequacy. Today, I approached it as an auditor, delivering a final verdict. I walked up the stone pathway. I bypassed the brass doorbell and used the old brass key I still kept on my ring. The heavy oak door swung open on silent hinges. The entryway smelled of expensive vanilla candles and fresh-cut lilies. The temperature inside was perfectly climate-controlled. I found them in the dining room. The layout had not changed since I was 18. The same glass dining table dominated the space. Diane sat at one end, flipping through a glossy architectural magazine. She wore a silk blouse and her signature diamond stud earrings. Richard stood near the bay window, reviewing emails on a silver tablet. He wore his weekend attire, consisting of pressed slacks and a cashmere quarter-zip sweater. Neither of them looked up immediately, assuming I was the housekeeper arriving for her scheduled shift. I stepped up to the edge of the glass table. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I opened the green cardstock folder and extracted the 50 pages of banking ledgers. I placed the stack directly in the center of the glass. The stark white paper contrasted sharply with the dark mahogany floor visible through the transparent surface. Diane glanced up. Her eyes fell on the documents. She registered the regional bank logo printed at the top corner of the first page. The color drained from her cheeks in a rapid, visible wave. Her facial muscles froze, locking into a rigid mask of calculated indignation. She closed her magazine and placed her hands flat on the table, bracing herself. Richard turned away from the window. He set his tablet down. He looked at me, then looked at the stack of papers. He did not ask what they were. He knew exactly what they were. These are the transaction histories for the joint checking account you opened using the power of attorney, I said. My voice echoed flat and even in the large room. The account where you routed the private student loans. The loans you took out after I graduated. Silence descended on the dining room. It was not the silence of shock or remorse. It was the tactical silence of two predators caught in a snare, recalibrating their strategy. Richard stepped forward. He did not flinch. He did not apologize. He deployed the calm, resonant, executive tone he utilized during hostile corporate acquisitions. He leaned his hands on the back of a dining chair and looked at me with an expression of mild parental disappointment. "Sophia, calm down," he instructed. "You are working yourself into an unnecessary panic. You lack the full financial context of how this family operates." I pointed a single finger at a specific highlighted line on the top page. "That is an $18,000 wire transfer to a Placer County stone contractor," I replied. "The date is 3 days after my sophomore year loan disbursement. You bought the Tahoe kitchen island with my credit while I was donating plasma to buy rice." Diane shifted in her seat. Her eyes narrowed. "You lived under this roof for 18 years, Sophia," she snapped. "We fed you, we clothed you, we funded your extracurricular activities. You cost us a fortune during your high school tenure. You have no idea the financial burden you placed on us." Richard held up a hand to silence her, stepping seamlessly into the role of the reasonable mediator. "What your mother means is that money is fluid within a family unit," he explained smoothly. "We absorb tremendous costs raising you. Think of these subsequent loans as retroactive room and board. We utilize the credit available to the family trust to secure hard assets. Those assets secure the legacy for everyone. You are looking at a localized ledger and missing the macroeconomic strategy." The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was breathtaking. They did not view their actions as theft. They viewed my identity as a corporate subsidiary they owned. They believed my future earnings and borrowing power were legitimate compensation for the basic biological requirement of raising a child. I did not engage in a debate. Arguing with a narcissist is a mathematical error. You cannot use logic to dismantle a delusion they require for their own survival. "I am not holding a grudge," I stated simply. "I am holding the evidence." I left the copies on the glass table. I turned around, walked out the oak front door, and drove back to my basement apartment. I expected retaliation. I anticipated a barrage of angry text messages or a demand to return and face further scolding. Instead, the rest of the day passed in total silence. The following morning, I prepared for my shift at the clinic. I stood at my laminate counter pouring cheap coffee into a travel mug. My cell phone vibrated on the counter. The caller identification displayed a local Sacramento area code. I answered the call. "Good morning, Sophia. This is Arthur Sterling." I recognized the name immediately. Arthur Sterling served as the primary legal counsel for my father's corporation. He also drafted the estate plans and handled the tax disputes for the family. He possessed a rich, resonant voice designed to project authority and inspire trust. "Mr. Sterling," I said cautiously. "Please call me Arthur," he replied, projecting deep paternal warmth. "I spoke with your parents late last night. They are very worried about you, Sophia. They told me you found some confusing financial paperwork and you are feeling overwhelmed. I want to help you navigate this." I gripped the edge of the laminate counter. For a brief, desperate fraction of a second, I felt a wave of relief. The prospect of having an experienced legal professional step in and untangle the nightmare was intoxicating. I was 28 years old, exhausted, and terrified. The idea of an ally offering a lifeline felt like a rescue. "I know the federal regulations surrounding educational loans can seem daunting," Arthur continued, his tone smooth and reassuring. "If you send me the bank documents you found and the notification letter from your mortgage broker, I can review them. I will interface with the lending institutions on your behalf. We will clear this up and protect your credit score without any messy public disputes." The clinical data manager inside my brain, the entity trained to spot statistical anomalies and logical inconsistencies, suddenly woke up. I stared at the peeling edge of my kitchen counter. I processed the variables. Arthur Sterling billed $600 an hour. He retained his position because he protected Richard's assets. He possessed a fiduciary duty to his client. I was not his client. The warmth in his voice was not empathy, it was reconnaissance. Arthur did not want to help me interface with the government. He wanted to know exactly what evidence I possessed. He needed to see the bank ledgers to understand the depth of my knowledge. Once he analyzed the paper trail, he could draft a legally binding cover-up. He could engineer a retroactive contract or a non-disclosure agreement to neutralize the threat I posed to his primary client. This was a red herring. It was a sophisticated trap designed to disarm me using my own exhaustion against me. "I need some time to organize my files, Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "I will contact your office when I am ready." I ended the call before he could press further. The realization washed over me like ice water. I stood alone in a damp basement, facing a united, well-funded machine. My parents possessed the capital to hire elite defense attorneys. They held decades of experience manipulating corporate narratives. They controlled the timeline, and they controlled the resources. If I tried to fight them in a standard civil dispute, they would crush me in litigation fees and procedural delays. They would drag the process out until I went bankrupt. I could not win a private war. I needed a weapon far more dangerous than a family lawyer. I needed an entity that did not care about Richard's executive title or Diane's suburban reputation. The quiet inquiry I initiated at the regional bank branch was already echoing through digital servers, triggering automated security protocols. The conflict was about to bypass the family dynamic entirely and land on the desk of federal investigators. The government was preparing to enter the arena, and the power dynamic was about to shift with brutal efficiency. 3 weeks elapsed following my brief conversation with the family attorney. 21 days of absolute silence from the suburban estate. I maintained my rigid routine. I woke up in the damp basement. I drove the damaged Honda to the urgent care clinic. I processed medical insurance codes until my vision blurred. I existed in a state of suspended animation, anticipating the next strategic maneuver from Richard's legal counsel. I assumed they were drafting a mountain of civil litigation to bury me. I underestimated the efficiency of automated financial security systems. The confrontation bypassed civil, family drama entirely on a Tuesday afternoon. I checked my rusted mailbox after a 10-hour shift. Inside sat a thick, stiff envelope. It did not bear the familiar blue logo of my private loan servicer. The return address featured the austere seal of the United States Department of Education, Office of the Inspector General. I carried the envelope inside. My hands felt unnervingly steady. I broke the seal and extracted a packet of dense legal documents. The cover letter explained the chain of events with clinical precision. When I stood at the polished mahogany counter of the regional bank branch, demanding my transaction ledgers, I initiated a cascade of automated security protocols. The banking software recognized a critical geographical discrepancy. I stood physically present in Sacramento, California, presenting verified government identification. Yet the joint checking account holding my name registered consistent daily digital access from an IP address located in Placer County. The system flagged the account for review. That internal bank review analyzed the origination of the 3 post-graduation promissory notes. The software traced the digital signatures back to the exact same Placer County router. The geographical footprint of the applicant did not match my established residential history. It matched the Tahoe vacation property. If the loans consisted entirely of private capital, the bank might have opted for a quiet internal settlement. However, the portfolio contained a blend of private and federal funds. The United States government guaranteed a specific percentage of that debt. Defrauding a commercial lender is a serious offense. Defrauding the federal government triggers an automatic criminal inquiry. The Inspector General had entered the arena. I turned to the second page of the packet. It was an affidavit of forgery. The instructions printed in bold typography outlined a stark binary choice. If I signed the document and provided a sworn statement under penalty of perjury that I did not authorize the signatures, the servicer would sever my liability. The $85,000 of fraudulent debt would be erased from my credit profile. The accumulated interest would vanish. But the erasure carried a secondary mandate. Upon receiving my sworn signature, the federal authorities would immediately pursue criminal wire fraud and identity theft charges against the verified holders of the joint account, Richard and Diane. I sat at my chipped laminate desk, staring at the signature line. For 31 years, my family conditioned me to absorb their burdens. They trained me to believe my purpose involved serving as the structural shock absorber for their vanity. I was the reliable scapegoat meant to manage the artificial poverty they engineered. I sacrificed my youth to protect their pristine narrative. Now the power dynamic fractured instantly. I rested my hand over the affidavit. I possessed the authority to dismantle their entire curated existence with a single stroke of blue ink. Suddenly, the silence of my basement apartment shattered. My cell phone vibrated against the hard surface of the desk, producing a sharp, buzzing sound. The screen illuminated the dim room. The caller identification displayed Richard's name. I did not answer. I watched the call roll to voicemail. Less than 30 seconds later, the screen lit up again. Diane. I let it ring. Over the next 2 hours, the device on my desk executed a relentless, frantic dance. The screen flashed 14 separate times. Richard called 6 times. Diane called 5 times. Even Trevor, the Golden brother, whose tuition I unwittingly subsidized, dialed my number 3 times. They were not calling because they knew about the affidavit sitting on my desk. They possessed no knowledge of the Inspector General or the impending forgery investigation. They were calling because the federal authorities had already initiated the preliminary containment procedures. The bank froze their assets. I listened to the first voicemail from Richard. His polished corporate resonance had disintegrated. He sounded breathless, panicked, the pitch of his voice rising in genuine terror. "Sophia, you need to answer the phone right now. The bank just locked our primary checking accounts. My corporate cards are declining. The teller mentioned a federal hold. What did you say to the regional manager? Call me back immediately." The second voicemail came from Trevor. My younger brother rarely reached out unless he required a favor. Now he sounded bewildered and angry. "Sophia, why are Mom and Dad saying you locked their money? My rent payment just bounced. Jessica is freaking out. Fix whatever you did." I sat back in my chair. The symphony of their panic played out in recorded segments. Richard, realizing his executive title held 0 jurisdiction over a federal auditor. Diane, discovering her ability to purchase imported goods, was abruptly terminated. Trevor facing the sudden evaporation of his unearned luxury. The people who spent a decade ignoring my quiet, desperate pleas for a simple tax form were now begging for my attention. They were trapped in an invisible cage, and they could feel the bars closing in. For the first time in my life, I did not feel a compulsive urge to answer their calls and soothe their anxiety. I felt a profound, icy calm. The fear radiating from my cell phone speaker mirrored the exact terror I experienced sitting in the campus bookstore, realizing I could not afford to pass my chemistry module. The scales of justice were finally beginning to balance. I picked up a pen. I tested the ink on a scrap piece of paper. The flow was smooth and dark. I positioned the tip over the signature line of the federal affidavit. But arrogant people do not surrender simply because their accounts are frozen. When cornered, individuals who operate on narcissism and entitlement become exceedingly dangerous. They transition from manipulation to overt hostility. They mobilize their resources to crush the perceived threat. I knew my parents would not accept a criminal investigation quietly. If they could not charm me into submission, they would attempt to destroy my credibility and coerce me through brute force. The frantic voicemails were merely the opening salvo of a much darker campaign. Panic induces a profound metamorphosis in individuals accustomed to unchallenged authority. When Richard failed to intimidate me through his frantic voicemails, the silence radiating from my basement apartment forced them to change tactics. They realized their accounts remained locked and their leverage had evaporated. Cornered and stripped of their financial superiority, they pivoted from administrative panic to calculated venom. Diane took command of the counteroffensive. She understood social optics far better than my father. If she could not force my compliance through direct intimidation, she needed to destroy my credibility before the federal investigation became public knowledge. She deployed her most practiced weapon. She activated the whisper network of our extended family. I sat at my chipped laminate desk, staring at the unsigned government affidavit. The screen of my cellular device illuminated. A text message arrived from Aunt Patricia. Patricia was my mother's older sister. She spent her entire adult life competing with Diane for the approval of their social circle, but she always deferred to Diane's superior wealth. Diane hosted the lavish holiday parties at the Tahoe property, so Patricia loyally echoed whatever narrative my mother constructed. I opened the message. The text read, "How could you do this to your mother? She is weeping in her kitchen right now. You need psychiatric help, Sophia. We are all praying for you to find your way back to reality." Before I could process the sheer cruelty of her words, a second message materialized. This one originated from Uncle David. "What kind of daughter extorts the people who gave her life? Call off this ridiculous charade." A third message arrived from my cousin Melissa. "Get help. Your shopping addiction is ruining this family. Stop blaming Aunt Diane for your credit card debt." The notifications began cascading down my screen in a rapid, unbroken sequence. The architecture of Diane's lie revealed itself through their accusations. It was a masterpiece of fabricated tragedy. She had contacted every relative, spinning a meticulous narrative, casting herself as the heartbroken matriarch held hostage by a delusional child. According to the fiction Diane distributed, I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. She claimed my rigid isolation over the past decade was not the result of extreme frugality, but rather a symptom of deep psychological instability. She told them I harbored a secret, manic shopping compulsion, drowning in consumer debt, hidden from the world. The crowning achievement of her lie involved my desire for a home. She told the family I fabricated the elaborate story of identity theft to extort them for a condominium down payment. She utilized a distorted fraction of the truth to sell the lie. I did want a tiny 600-square-foot condo. I was obsessed with my financial ledgers. She simply swapped my survival mechanics for a manic disorder. I read the incoming messages. The physiological response fascinated me. I expected to feel the familiar hollow sting of inadequacy. I anticipated a wave of desperate anxiety urging me to call Patricia and David to explain the truth. I expected to cry. I did none of those things. I felt a quiet, profound grief. It is a peculiar sorrow to watch the erasure of your familial bonds play out over a digital network. These people knew me for 3 decades. They watched me wear thrift store coats and drive a rusted car with a cracked windshield. They saw my exhaustion at every rare holiday gathering I attended. Yet they embraced the fiction of my secret shopping addiction without a single critical inquiry. They preferred the comfortable lie that protected Diane's affluent status over the difficult truth of my suffering. The grief passed, quickly replaced by a sharp, clinical clarity. Engaging with the smear campaign validates the premise of the attacker. Typing out defensive paragraphs outlining the truth would only provide them with more material to twist. It would show them I still cared about their perception. I opened the photo application on my device. I captured a screen image of Aunt Patricia's cruel accusation. The screen flashed white in the dim basement. I saved the image file. I navigated to her contact profile. I tapped the red text that read, "Block caller." I repeated the sequence for Uncle David. Capture the screen, save the image, block the contact. I moved down the list to Cousin Melissa. Capture, save, block. I executed the systematic digital amputation of my extended bloodline. Each block felt like setting a heavy stone into a defensive wall. I did not type a single response. I let their accusations hit a silent barrier. I connected my phone to my laptop. I transferred the captured images into a designated folder on an external hard drive. I created a permanent archive of their complicity. They provided written documentation of Diane's coordinated harassment. If the federal prosecutor ever required evidence of witness intimidation or character assassination, I now possessed a categorized digital dossier. The process took 20 minutes. When I finished, I navigated to the settings menu on my device. I engaged the Do Not Disturb function. The sudden peace in my apartment was vast and heavy. The relentless buzzing ceased. The glowing screen faded to black. I sat in the quiet, listening to the steady hum of my aging refrigerator. The relief was instantaneous. It washed through my chest, loosening the tight knot of tension I carried since childhood. For my entire life, I operated under the assumption that I owed my family my obedience. I believed maintaining the appearance of a unified family justified my silent suffering. I realized in that quiet basement that I did not owe my destruction to their comfort. I was free. Severing those ties did not leave me empty. It left me unburdened. The extended family members were merely collateral damage in Diane's war. They chose their allegiance. Let them scream into the digital void. Let them comfort my mother while her assets remained frozen by the Inspector General. Their opinions held zero jurisdiction over a federal audit. I turned my attention back to the physical documents on my desk. The smear campaign served as the social execution, but the legal trap was still pending. Arrogant people leave paper trails because they believe the rules do not apply to them. Diane controlled the family gossip, but Richard controlled the legal strategy. 48 hours after the text messages ceased, a sharp knock echoed from my basement door. I walked across the peeling laminate floor and opened the door. A professional courier stood on the concrete landing. He wore a uniform and held a digital signature pad. He handed me a crisp, flat cardboard envelope. The return address featured the embossed gold logo of Arthur Sterling's law firm. I signed for the delivery and locked the door. I sat at my desk and pulled the designated pull tab on the cardboard. Inside rested a single piece of heavy bond paper and a smaller, handwritten note. I read the note first. It was penned on Diane's custom stationery. The cursive script was elegant and steady. Sophia, we need to resolve this terrible misunderstanding as a family. We are hosting a dinner this Saturday at the Tahoe house. Please attend. We have a solution that will benefit everyone. I set the note aside and examined the formal document. It was a promissory note. The legal language was dense, drafted with predatory precision. It stated that I, Sophia Jones, knowingly and willingly gifted the sum of $85,000 to Richard and Diane Jones for the purpose of real estate investment. Arthur Sterling had backdated the contract to my 23rd birthday. The strategy was breathtaking in its arrogance. Richard and Diane needed a legitimate document to present to the federal investigators. If I signed this retroactive contract, it would legally reclassify the fraudulent wire transfers as a permitted family loan. It would instantly legitimize their crime, unfreeze their assets, and kill the federal inquiry. They wanted me to commit federal perjury to save them from prison. They attached this demand to an invitation for a family dinner. They intended to use the setting of the Tahoe vacation home, the very property purchased with my stolen future, as the stage for my final surrender. They believed if they surrounded me with the trappings of their wealth and the pressure of their presence, I would fold. I looked at the backdated contract. I looked at the green manila folder containing the bank ledgers. I looked at the unsigned federal affidavit of forgery. I did not panic. I reached for my calendar. I cleared my schedule for Saturday. I decided to attend the dinner. The illusion required a final confrontation, and I intended to bring the quiet, devastating reality of their actions directly onto their custom Italian marble island. Saturday morning arrived bearing a bitter frost that coated the windshield of my aging vehicle. The drive up Interstate 80 toward the Sierra Nevada mountains required 2 hours of careful navigation. My rusted car struggled against the steep elevation grade, the engine whining in protest as the altitude increased. The air grew thinner, and the dense urban sprawl of Sacramento gave way to towering pine trees and snow-capped peaks. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the vibration of the road through my palms. I was driving into the heart of their curated illusion. The Tahoe property sat at the end of a private, winding road adjacent to the pristine lake. I parked my dented sedan on the sweeping circular driveway right next to Trevor's pristine Jeep Wrangler and Richard's imported luxury sedan. The visual contrast between my daily reality and their stolen opulence was stark. I turned off the ignition. I retrieved the cardboard envelope containing the backdated contract from the passenger seat. I did not bring the green manila folder. The banking ledgers were safely secured in a digital vault and locked in my basement desk. I walked up the wide timber steps and pushed open the heavy front door. The cabin smelled of roasted pine wood smoke and expensive cedar candles. The temperature inside was perfectly regulated, offering a stark contrast to the freezing mountain air behind me. The architectural layout featured an open concept, allowing me to see the entire living space from the entryway. Trevor and his wife Jessica occupied the expansive leather sofa in the living room. They were positioned deliberately, serving as a silent, moral audience for the impending negotiation. Jessica wore pristine white cashmere loungewear, holding a ceramic mug of coffee. Trevor scrolled through a cellular device projecting an aura of mild annoyance, as if my presence interrupted his leisurely weekend retreat. They represented the societal pressure my parents intended to weaponize against me. Diane stood near the kitchen sink. She wore a tailored wool sweater and held a crystal wine glass filled with mineral water. Her smile was tight, brittle, and entirely devoid of warmth. She did not offer a greeting. She simply gestured toward the center of the room. I stepped forward and approached the custom Italian marble island. The stone was breathtaking in person, a stark, brilliant white canvas laced with deep, intricate veins of charcoal gray. It felt cold, radiating a dense physical weight. I rested my fingertips against the polished surface. I allowed myself to process the profound physical connection. This specific piece of luxury rock existed in this room because I spent 3 years sitting in a clinical donation center, allowing a machine to harvest my blood plasma. It was purchased with the funds diverted from my forged signature. Richard emerged from a hallway adjacent to the kitchen. He wore a heavy knit sweater and dark slacks, projecting the image of a relaxed, wealthy patriarch holding court in his domain. He carried a silver fountain pen. The exact same pen he handed me 13 years ago at the glass dining table in Sacramento. He approached the opposite side of the marble island. He placed both hands on the stone, leaning forward slightly to establish dominance. "Sophia," he began, his tone smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of apology. "I am glad you decided to act rationally and join us today. The past few weeks have been unnecessarily tense. We need to rectify this clerical misunderstanding before it spirals further out of proportion." He reached into his pocket and extracted a folded check. He placed it on the marble and slid it across the smooth surface toward me. He then gestured toward the cardboard envelope I held in my hand. "I know you are trying to secure financing for that small condominium," Richard continued. "The real estate market is unforgiving for young buyers. Your mother and I discussed it. We want to offer you an advance on your inheritance. That check is drafted for $10,000 cash." It will cover your closing costs and provide a comfortable buffer for furnishings. I looked down at the slip of paper. The amount was written in bold, black ink. All you need to do, Richard instructed, tapping the marble surface, is execute the document Arthur Sterling prepared for you. You sign the promissory note, acknowledging the prior capital was a willing family gift designated for real estate investment. Family protects family, Sophia. We keep our affairs private. We settle our ledgers internally. Jessica chimed in from the leather sofa. Her voice drifted across the room, dripping with condescending concern. You should take the offer, Sophia, she advised. Life is far too short to hold on to toxic grievances over administrative errors. Your parents have given you so much. It is time to let go of the anger and move forward. I kept my gaze fixed on Richard. The dramatic irony suspended in the room was thick, intoxicating, and profoundly satisfying. Richard stood across from me wearing expensive wool, offering a generous financial olive branch. He projected total control. But I possessed a secret that rendered his entire performance obsolete. I knew the automated federal security protocols had already triggered. I knew the Inspector General had intervened. Richard was attempting to bribe me using a checking account that the federal government had already frozen. He was offering me $10,000 he no longer legally possessed. He was desperately trying to secure my signature to save a vacation house that was currently encumbered by a federal title hold. He was negotiating with phantom capital, standing inside a property he could no longer liquidate. The arrogance required to forge a signature is vast, but the arrogance required to bribe the victim using the very same stolen funds is staggering. He waited for me to pick up the pen. He expected my lifelong conditioning to override my logic. He assumed the allure of $10,000 would blind me to the reality of the $85,000 they stole. He needed me to commit federal perjury under the guise of familial loyalty. I did not reach for the check. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my own pen, a cheap plastic ballpoint I stole from the urgent care clinic break room. I slid the heavy bond paper out of the cardboard envelope. I laid the backdated contract flat against the cold Italian marble. I read the final paragraph, detailing my supposed willingness to gift them my collegiate funding. You are asking me to commit federal perjury for $10,000, I stated. My voice was quiet, carrying effortlessly through the silent cabin. You want me to absorb a potential felony charge to legitimize your theft. All while you retain the $85,000 you funneled into this property. Diane stiffened by the sink. Richard narrowed his eyes, the corporate facade fracturing slightly at the edges. Sophia, do not be dramatic, he warned, his tone dropping an octave. It is a simple reclassification of assets. You are letting your emotions dictate your financial strategy. Sign the document and take the capital. I uncapped my plastic pen. I pressed the tip firmly against the heavy bond paper, right above the line designated for my signature. I am not acting on emotion, I replied. I am acting on the data. I dragged the pen across the paper. I did not sign my name. I drew a single, thick, black line straight through the signature block, scoring the paper deeply. I pressed hard enough to leave a faint indentation on the marble surface beneath it. I canceled the contract. The sharp scratching sound of the pen resonated in the quiet room. I dropped the plastic pen on top of the ruined document. I picked up the $10,000 check and slid it back across the island toward Richard. You are going to need this more than I do, I told him. The silence that followed was absolute. The moral audience on the leather sofa sat paralyzed. Trevor's phone dropped into his lap. Jessica's mouth parted in silent shock. Richard stared at the black lines slashing through his legal salvation. The color drained from his face as the realization hit him. The scapegoat had refused the harness. Diane lost her composure entirely. The mask of the dignified matriarch shattered. She gripped the crystal glass in her hand with sudden, uncontrolled fury. She slammed the glass down against the edge of the stainless steel sink. The crystal exploded. The sharp, cracking sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Shards of delicate glass rained down into the metal basin and scattered across the hardwood floor. Diane gasped, stepping back, holding her empty hand suspended in the air. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I turned away from the marble island. I did not look at Trevor or Jessica. I walked toward the heavy front door. I pulled it open, allowing the freezing mountain wind to rush into the climate-controlled sanctuary. I stepped out onto the timber porch and pulled the door firmly shut behind me. I walked down the steps toward my rusted vehicle. The engine roared to life on the first turn of the key. I backed out of the sweeping driveway and steered toward the descending mountain highway. The peace I felt driving away was entirely new. I had delivered my final verdict. The confrontation was over, but the mechanical reality of their situation was just beginning to tighten its grip. Richard and Diane were now out of options. Stripped of my compliance and facing a frozen checking account, they would be forced into a corner. They would attempt the only desperate maneuver left available to affluent individuals facing imminent ruin. They would try to liquidate their most valuable physical asset. They were going to try to sell the lake house, unaware that the trap they built for themselves had already snapped shut around the foundation. 2 days passed since the shattered crystal rained down on the hardwood floor of the Tahoe cabin. I returned to my standard routine. Monday morning found me sitting inside a sterile cubicle at the urgent care clinic. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low mechanical hum. I stared at my dual monitors, verifying insurance codes and tracking patient data. My environment was rigid, predictable, and governed by strict numerical rules. Miles away in a high-rise corporate office, my father was experiencing an environment devoid of any rules he could control. Richard understood the terrifying velocity of a federal audit. He knew my refusal to sign the backdated promissory note dismantled his primary defense strategy. Without my signature validating the fraudulent transfers as a willing family gift, he lacked a legal shield. The Department of Education would not halt their inquiry. They would soon transition from automated financial holds to formal subpoenas. Cornered executives do not surrender. They liquidate. Richard devised a rapid containment protocol. He needed to erase the $85,000 debt before the government could officially indict him. If he could generate enough clean, liquid capital, he could pay off the loan servicer in full. He believed satisfying the outstanding balance would close the ledger and terminate the federal interest. To acquire that specific volume of unencumbered cash, he needed to sacrifice a major asset. The suburban Sacramento estate was heavily tied to his corporate equity, and Diane would never allow her primary social stage to be sold. The solution was obvious. The Tahoe vacation property had to go. He operated with frantic precision. By Monday afternoon, he contacted a premier luxury real estate broker in Placer County. He bypassed the standard staging and marketing procedures. He ordered the broker to list the waterfront cabin immediately, prioritizing speed over maximum profit. He priced the property slightly below market value to trigger an expedited bidding war. The strategy worked initially. The Tahoe real estate market possessed an endless supply of affluent tech developers and venture capitalists seeking winter retreats. Within 24 hours, a buyer submitted an all-cash offer. The buyer waived the standard inspection contingencies, eager to secure the premium location. Richard accepted the proposal without hesitation. The transaction entered the escrow phase. For a brief, fleeting moment, Richard likely felt a surge of triumphant relief. He believed his superior intellect had navigated the family out of a fatal disaster. He thought he outsmarted the rigid constraints of the system. He did not understand the unforgiving mechanics of a federal title search. When high-value real estate enters escrow, a neutral third party conducts a rigorous examination of the property deed. The title company must ensure the asset transfers to the new owner free of any hidden debts, disputes, or legal claims. They comb through county records, tax assessments, and thanking histories related to the structure. The title officer handling the Tahoe cabin ran the standard verification matrices. The software hit a reinforced digital wall. The Inspector General had already mapped the topography of the crime. The federal auditors tracked the stolen loan disbursements from my forged promissory notes directly into the joint checking account. They followed the subsequent wire transfers out of that account. They noted the exact origin of the initial $18,000 down payment for the Italian Marble Island. They recorded the sequential property tax payments routed to the county assessor. Because the physical house was purchased and maintained using defrauded, government-backed funds, the government staked a preemptive claim on the structure. The Office of the Inspector General placed a federal encumbrance on the deed. The title was clouded. The property was legally paralyzed. It could not be sold, transferred, or leveraged for additional equity until the federal inquiry reached a formal conclusion. The escrow collapsed instantly. The cash buyer withdrew the offer. The luxury broker informed my father that his prized waterfront asset was frozen. The brick wall Richard slammed into was constructed entirely from his own arrogance. Wednesday afternoon, I sat at my desk cross-referencing a complex billing discrepancy for the clinic. The clinic floor was quiet, save for the occasional chime of the automatic sliding doors. My cell phone rested on the laminate desk surface. It began to vibrate. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I picked up the device and accepted the call. I did not offer a greeting. I brought the speaker to my ear and waited. The voice that transmitted through the receiver lacked any trace of the polished corporate mediator. The carefully maintained facade of the wealthy patriarch had burned away, leaving only a raw, unhinged panic. "You put a lien on our house," Richard screamed. His volume was so piercing, I had to pull the phone several inches away from my head. A nurse walking past my cubicle paused and cast a concerned glance in my direction. I offered her a slight reassuring nod, and she continued down the hallway. I brought the phone back to my ear. Richard was hyperventilating, his breathing ragged and uneven. "You vindictive, ungrateful brat," he shouted, his words slurring together in his rage. "I try to give you an advance on your inheritance, and you repay me by sabotaging the escrow. You called the county clerk. You filed a malicious dispute. Do you have any idea what you have done?" The buyer walked away. I listened to his accusation. The psychology of his panic was fascinating. Even when faced with the catastrophic failure of his own criminal enterprise, he instinctively projected the blame onto his designated scapegoat. He could not process the reality that a superior authority had outmaneuvered him. He needed to believe I was the architect of his ruin, because acknowledging the federal government meant acknowledging his impending incarceration. I waited for him to pause for oxygen. When a brief second of silence opened on the line, I delivered the data. "I did not put a lien on the property, Richard," I said, keeping my tone flat and icy. "I do not possess the legal jurisdiction to encumber real estate." "Who filed the hold?" then he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "The Office of the Inspector General filed the encumbrance," I replied. "They trace the origin of capital. They know the down payment and the property taxes originated from the forged student loans. The government placed the hold because they view your cabin as evidence of wire fraud." The silence that stretched across the cellular connection was profound. I could hear the faint sound of his uneven breathing. I could picture him standing in his executive office, the realization dropping over him like a suffocating shroud. "You are trapped," I told him. "You cannot sell the house to pay the debt. You cannot use the house to secure a legal defense loan. You bought a monument to your own vanity using my name, and now it belongs to the federal government." I pressed the red icon on my screen and ended the call. I set the phone back on my desk. my pulse remained steady. My hands did not shake. The Tahoe house, the pristine structure featuring vaulted timber ceilings and imported stone, once represented the ultimate symbol of their opulence and my prolonged suffering. It was the physical manifestation of the disparity between my rusted vehicle and their luxury lifestyle. Now the paradigm had inverted completely. The vacation home transformed into an inescapable prison. It became a heavy, immovable anchor chained directly to their necks. Every passing day accrued more federal interest, drawing the authorities closer to a formal indictment. My parents were marooned on their own property, waiting for the inevitable arrival of law enforcement. The invisible war transitioned from digital holds and frozen accounts to physical actions. The paper trail was secure, and the automated systems had performed their duties flawlessly. The next phase required human intervention. The government needed to verify the digital evidence with sworn physical testimony. The quiet inquiry was concluding, and the active prosecution was beginning. Formal legal documents were being drafted in government offices, and men carrying federal badges were preparing to pay me a visit. 72 hours after my father realized his waterfront sanctuary was legally paralyzed, the federal government arrived at my workplace. Thursday morning unfolded with standard clinical precision. I sat inside my cubicle verifying alphanumeric insurance codes against patient intake forms. The clinic maintained a quiet, steady rhythm. At 10:15, the front desk receptionist navigated the narrow hallway and paused at the edge of my partition. She looked uneasy. She informed me 2 gentlemen were waiting in the lobby requesting a brief interview. I locked my workstation screen and walked toward the reception area. 2 men stood near the sliding glass entrance. They wore identical dark charcoal suits tailored conservatively. They did not project the aggressive intimidation of local law enforcement. They radiated the calm, quiet authority of federal auditors. The taller man held a thin leather briefcase. The other held a standard aluminum clipboard. They approached me offering firm handshakes. They introduced themselves as special agents operating under the Office of the Inspector General for the Department of Education. They asked if we could utilize a private space to discuss a sensitive financial inquiry. I guided them to an empty conference room at the rear of the clinic. The room smelled of dry erase markers and sanitized surfaces. I took a seat on one side of the faux wood table. The agents sat opposite me. They moved with coordinated efficiency, placing the leather briefcase on the table and extracting a series of manila envelopes. The taller agent opened his file. He asked me to verify my current address, my date of birth, and my social security number. I recited the data points smoothly. He then withdrew a printed spreadsheet and laid it flat on the table. We need to establish your geographical footprint between the years 2018 and 2020, he said, his tone even and respectful. Could you describe your residential situation and your internet access during that specific window? I looked at the agent. I cast my memory back to that grueling era of my life. During those years, I occupied the damp basement apartment. My budget was stripped down to the bare structural studs. I lived in a below-ground unit on the east side of the city, I answered. I did not possess a wireless internet connection. I could not afford the monthly utility fee. The agent holding the clipboard made a brief notation. How did you handle your digital correspondence or banking needs, he inquired. I utilized the municipal library, I explained. It sat 4 blocks away from my apartment. When I needed to check my meager checking account balance or email my urgent care supervisor, I walked there. I used my library card to reserve a public computer for 45-minute sessions. I remembered those walks vividly. I remembered pacing through heavy winter rain wearing boots with thinning soles, just to sit in a drafty public building smelling of old paper and damp wool. I remembered watching the digital timer on the corner of the library monitor, counting down my allotted minutes while I desperately tried to balance my spreadsheet. The taller agent nodded. He rotated the printed spreadsheet toward me. These are the digital access logs for the 3 maximum limit private student loans originated under your identity, he stated. Every digital application, every electronic signature, every promissory note generates an Internet Protocol address. An IP address serves as a digital fingerprint detailing exactly where the computer was located when the documents were executed. I scanned the columns of numbers printed on the sheet. None of these digital handshakes originated from a municipal library in Sacramento, the agent continued. The Federal Cybercrimes Unit traced every single IP address listed on this page back to one specific point of origin. They all route to a residential Comcast network router. That router is registered to Richard Jones. The physical location of the hardware is a property situated in Placer County. The geographical impossibility was stark and undeniable. While I was rationing generic rice and walking through the freezing rain to borrow free internet, my identity was being harvested on a high-speed network inside a luxury cabin. My father sat in a climate-controlled room overlooking a pristine lake, logging onto his private network to forge his daughter's name. I pushed the spreadsheet back toward the center of the table. But the agents were not finished. The IP logs merely proved the mechanics of the wire fraud. The Inspector General handles educational theft, but financial crimes of this magnitude rarely stay confined to a single federal agency. Criminal arrogance tends to leak into multiple jurisdictions. The second agent reached into the leather briefcase. He produced a different stack of documents. These pages featured the distinct, austere formatting of the Internal Revenue Service. He placed a copy of a standard 1040 tax return in front of me. "We subpoenaed your father's tax records as part of the asset freeze," the agent explained. "We found a rather compelling secondary violation. Are you familiar with the 1098E deduction, Sophia?" I stared at the tax form. A cold, sharp wave of realization washed over my skin. I was intimately familiar with the 1098E form. Years ago, when the grace period ended and the crushing monthly payments began, I begged Richard to provide that specific document. I pleaded with him to let me claim the interest deduction so I could secure a meager refund. He scolded me. He called me selfish. He claimed his accountant required it to offset the risk of co-signing my cheap basement lease. "Look at Schedule 1, the agent instructed, pointing to a specific line item on the tax return. I traced his finger. There, printed in bold black ink, was the exact amount of student loan interest I had surrendered that year, nearly $17,000. Richard did not just steal my credit to purchase a vacation home. He weaponized the resulting debt to cheat the Internal Revenue Service. The exorbitant interest generating from those forged loans offered a lucrative tax loophole. By claiming the deduction on his own executive tax returns, Richard artificially lowered his taxable income bracket. He stole the principal, and then he monetized the compounding interest. He was essentially double-dipping his crime, drawing a profit from my suffering while the federal government subsidized the fraud. This was the detail that fired the Chekhov's gun. The lie he told me years ago to preserve his tax scam was now the exact piece of evidence that elevated his crime from simple identity theft to federal tax evasion. "Do you possess any documentation that might assist our timeline?" the taller agent asked. I did not weep. I did not express outrage. The years of enforced frugality, the endless nights spent processing medical codes and balancing pennies, had stripped away my emotional volatility. The trauma had not broken me. It had forged me into an elite, meticulous record keeper. I reached down and unzipped my work tote. I withdrew the thick green manila folder. I placed it gently on the faux wood table between the two federal agents. Inside, you will find the transaction ledgers for the joint checking account I stated. The pages highlight the specific wire transfers routed to the Placer County tax assessor and the luxury stone contractors. The agents opened the folder. Their eyes scanned the immaculate chronological records. I reached deeper into the folder and produced the cardboard envelope delivered to my apartment days earlier. You will also find a backdated promissory note I added. My father's legal counsel drafted it last week. They invited me to the Tahoe property and offered me $10,000 in cash to sign it. They wanted me to reclassify the stolen funds as a willing real estate investment gift. I drew a line through the signature block. The taller agent looked at the ruined contract. He looked at the thick stack of bank ledgers. He looked back at me. The subtle shift in his posture communicated a deep, profound respect. Federal agents spend their careers hunting elusive paper trails. I had just handed them a fully assembled, irrefutable prosecution dossier wrapped in green cardstock. "We have everything we need, Sophia," he said softly. He returned the documents to the leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. The agents stood up, pushed their chairs in, and thanked me for my cooperation. I walked them back to the sliding glass doors of the clinic. I watched them step out into the bright California sun and climb into a nondescript government vehicle. The quiet investigative phase was officially over. The trap was locked and the keys were thrown away. The next step in the federal sequence required all parties to gather in a single room under oath to process the evidence on the official record. A formal deposition was imminent. I knew Richard and Diane would be compelled to sit across a mahogany table and face the ruin they authored. But the impending deposition held one final devastating variable. Because the Golden brother had tethered his entire luxurious existence to my parents' unchecked wealth, Trevor was going to demand a seat in that sterile room. He intended to show up and defend the architects of his unearned success. He had no idea he was walking blindly into a blast radius. 4 weeks after the federal agents walked out of the urgent care clinic, the legal machinery finalized its preparations. The United States government issued formal subpoenas, compelling all involved parties to provide sworn testimony. The venue was a federal building located in the heart of downtown Sacramento. I navigated the security checkpoint on the ground floor. I placed my coat and purse into the plastic bin, watching them glide through the X-ray scanner. I retrieved my belongings and rode the stainless steel elevator up to the designated floor. The doors parted to reveal a silent hallway smelling of ozone and industrial floor wax. I stepped into the assigned conference room. The space was sterile and unforgiving. Stark fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat, pale illumination that offered nowhere to hide. A long, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. A court reporter sat at the far end setting up a stenograph machine. Richard and Diane were already seated on the opposing side of the heavy wooden table. They looked fundamentally changed. The weeks spent living under a federal asset freeze had stripped away their affluent armor. Richard sat with his shoulders slumped. The deep tan he usually maintained from weekend golf outings had faded into a sickly gray pallor. The skin around his eyes appeared bruised and heavy. Diane sat rigid next to him. She wore a pristine, tailored suit crafted from navy blue wool. It was a designer garment, likely possessing a retail value of $2,000. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. I took my seat across from them. Next to me sat the federal prosecutor handling the case. He wore a simple gray suit and possessed the calm, unhurried demeanor of a man who held all the winning cards. I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Behind my parents, against the back wall of the conference room, sat a row of observer chairs. Trevor occupied one of those seats. My younger brother had insisted on attending the proceeding. He sat with his arms crossed over a premium cotton polo shirt. He glared at me with unfiltered disdain. He still operated under the delusion constructed by Diane's smear campaign. He firmly believed he was sitting in that room to support his persecuted parents. He thought he was about to watch the federal government expose his sister as a mentally unstable extortionist. He viewed me as a destructive force attempting to ruin the family. I turned my attention away from Trevor and focused on Diane. Looking at her impeccable designer suit, a vivid memory breached my clinical detachment. The sheer cost of the fabric she wore triggered a visceral flashback, transporting me 12 years into the past. I was 19 years old. I was sitting on the cracked linoleum floor of my cramped collegiate apartment. The heater was broken, and a bitter draft seeped through the poorly sealed window. I held a plastic bowl containing plain, boiled white rice flavored with nothing but tap water and a stolen packet of soy sauce. Spread across the floor in front of me were my biology textbooks and a printed syllabus. I needed $40 to pay an online portal fee for a mandatory science module. Without that module, I could not pass the course. I had checked my bank balance 3 times, hoping a pending transaction might clear. The account held $2.14. I sat on that cold linoleum floor eating tasteless starch and wept quietly into my hands. I cried because I felt like a profound failure. I thought I lacked the intelligence and the stamina required to survive in the adult world. The shame was a physical weight pressing down on my ribs. I did not know that, at the exact moment I was crying over a $40 educational fee, my mother was standing in a luxury boutique holding a credit card issued under my forged signature. She was swiping my stolen identity to purchase designer garments and imported home goods. She wore the proceeds of my invisible labor while I starved in the dark. The contrast between her $2,000 suit and my plastic bowl of rice anchored me. The brief emotional flashback evaporated. I returned to the present moment inside the fluorescent conference room, feeling nothing but cold, focused resolve. The court reporter instructed everyone to state their names for the record. The mechanical clicking of the stenograph began. Arthur Sterling sat adjacent to my father. The family lawyer immediately attempted to seize control of the narrative. He cleared his throat, adjusting his gold cufflinks, and launched into a prepared monologue designed to dismiss the severity of the charges. "We are dealing with a tragic familial misunderstanding here," Sterling stated, his resonant voice filling the sterile room. "My client's daughter has long struggled with basic fiscal literacy. She incurred standard collegiate debt and became overwhelmed by the capitalization of her interest rates. In her confusion, she has misinterpreted a series of routine family trust transfers. She is viewing standard parental financial management through a lens of extreme emotional distress." Sterling aimed to gaslight the federal government. He used patronizing, sophisticated language to paint me as a hysterical child incapable of understanding complex ledger entries. He wanted the prosecutor to view me as an unreliable witness, projecting my own failures onto my benevolent parents. The federal prosecutor let Sterling finish his opening remarks. He did not interrupt. He simply waited for the lawyer to stop speaking. Then the prosecutor opened his leather portfolio. "Let us dispense with the psychological evaluations, Mr. Sterling," the prosecutor said. His tone was dry, clinical, and entirely devoid of sympathy. "We are not here to debate your client's parenting style. We are here to address a series of documented wire transfers originating from fraudulent loan applications." The prosecutor withdrew a thick stack of printed records. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was the exact data set I provided in the green manila folder, cross-referenced with the official findings from the Inspector General. "Your clients executed 3 private promissory notes using the Social Security number belonging to Sophia Jones," the prosecutor continued. "The digital footprints place the execution of those documents inside your client's primary residence. The funds were funneled into a joint checking account where the victim possessed no access." Richard stared at the mahogany table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Diane stared straight ahead, her jaw locked tight. "The paper trail is undeniable," the prosecutor stated. He slid the first sequence of documents across the polished wood, placing them directly in front of Sterling. "The total sum of the fraudulent capital procured under these specific notes equals $85,000, the prosecutor announced. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his chair against the back wall. The figure hung in the air. $85,000. It was an astronomical sum to steal from a college student earning minimum wage. The Federal Cybercrimes Division tracked the subsequent dispersal of that $85,000. The prosecutor explained, "We possess the exact ledger detailing where your clients routed the stolen funds." The prosecutor tapped a printed spreadsheet with the end of his pen. "Let us begin with the first $40,000, he said. "The records indicate this sum was utilized entirely for real estate acquisition and maintenance. $18,000 routed to a luxury stone contractor in Placer County for a custom kitchen installation. $14,000 routed to the county tax assessor to clear property liens. $8,000 routed to various exterior design firms for landscaping and furnishings." The prosecutor looked up from the paper, meeting Richard's gaze. "Your clients utilized $40,000 of stolen credit to fund their Tahoe vacation property," the prosecutor concluded. "We hold the receipts from the contractors. We hold the wire confirmations from the regional bank. The asset is currently frozen under federal authority." Sterling remained silent. He could not argue against hard, verifiable bank receipts. The narrative of the confused, financially illiterate daughter had just been dismantled by cold, federal arithmetic. Richard closed his eyes. The defeat radiating from his posture was total. He knew the vacation home was lost. He knew the tax evasion charges were pending. But the arithmetic presented a glaring discrepancy. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and the rhythmic breathing of the people seated around the table. If $40,000 funded the Tahoe property, a substantial sum remained unaccounted for. The prosecutor let the silence stretch, allowing the numerical reality to settle over the room. He picked up a second, thicker ledger, bound with a black binder clip. "That accounts for $40,000, the prosecutor said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. But the promissory notes totaled $85,000. He slid the thick ledger across the mahogany table. It stopped mere inches from Diane's folded hands. "What about the remaining $45,000, the prosecutor asked. Diane flinched as if the ledger was a physical threat. She finally broke her stoic facade, letting out a small, ragged gasp. Richard kept his eyes closed, unable to witness the impending detonation. Sterling picked up the document. He scanned the top page. His professional composure faltered. He set the paper down and looked at his clients with an expression of genuine shock. The lawyer did not know. Richard and Diane had hidden the final destination of the funds even from their own legal counsel. The truth was about to detonate inside that fluorescent room. It was a truth that would destroy the family dynamic forever. It would shatter the carefully constructed hierarchy that governed our lives. Most importantly, it was about to expose the Golden Child's pristine narrative as an elaborate criminal fiction built entirely on my stolen signature. The audience member sitting against the back wall was about to become the center of the tragedy. The federal prosecutor leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the mahogany table. The sterile conference room felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The mechanical clicking of the court reporter's stenograph machine paused, waiting for the official record to resume. Arthur Sterling, the seasoned corporate lawyer, stared down at the ledger detailing the destination of the final $45,000. His silence was profoundly indicative of the severity of the document. He had been prepared to defend a case of parental financial overreach involving real estate assets. He was not prepared to defend the systematic exploitation of one child to fund the extravagant lifestyle of another. The prosecutor did not wait for Sterling to formulate a defense. He addressed the room with surgical precision. The remaining $45,000 did not funnel into the Placer County vacation property, the prosecutor stated, reading directly from his own copy of the ledger. The capital was divided into two distinct sequential streams. He flipped to the second page of the document. The first stream, consisting of $26,000, originated from the joint checking account and routed directly to the bursar's office of a private university located in the Pacific Northwest, he read. The funds were classified as a direct tuition and housing payment for the enrollment of Trevor Jones. The sharp, sudden sound of a sharp intake of breath echoed from the back wall of the room. It did not come from me. It did not come from Diane or Richard. The gasp came from Trevor. My younger brother sat paralyzed in his observer chair. The aggressive posture he maintained since entering the room, the crossed arms and the contemptuous glare, had vanished instantly. He leaned forward, staring at the back of his father's head with an expression of bewildered horror. The golden child, the beneficiary of the pristine narrative, had just collided with the mathematical reality of his own existence. The prosecutor continued, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. The second stream, comprising $19,000, was utilized to satisfy a series of delinquent credit accounts, the prosecutor explained. The accounts in question were revolving consumer credit lines issued to Trevor Jones. The transaction dates correlate precisely with periods of high-volume spending at luxury retail establishments, high-end hospitality venues, and international travel agencies. Trevor gripped the arms of his chair. His knuckles turned white. For years, Trevor operated under a meticulously constructed delusion. He believed his parents possessed the vast liquid wealth necessary to fund his expensive private education without requiring him to assume a single dollar of collegiate debt. When he graduated and married Jessica, he continued to live beyond his means. He desperately attempted to maintain the affluent Orange County lifestyle his new wife expected. He racked up massive consumer debt, renting luxury vehicles, purchasing designer watches, and booking premium vacations. When the inevitable collection notices arrived, Trevor quietly approached Richard for a financial bailout. Richard, acting the part of the wealthy, benevolent patriarch, agreed to clear the ledgers and save his son from a ruined credit score. Trevor assumed his father liquidated a minor stock portfolio or dipped into a corporate bonus to settle the $19,000 debt. He never questioned the origin of the rescue funds. He simply accepted the bailout as his birthright. The truth detonated in the fluorescent lighting of that federal room. Richard and Diane did not possess the liquid capital to rescue him. They did not fund his private tuition out of their own pockets. They financed his entire existence utilizing the forged signature of his older sister. The parents had literally stolen from the responsible daughter, the one working double shifts and donating plasma, to fund the irresponsible son's facade. Trevor stared at the mahogany table. The realization washed over him, reshaping his entire identity in real time. His pristine, debt-free success story was a criminal fiction. The luxury apartment, the imported vehicle, the premium vacations with Jessica, they were all subsidized by my financial indentured servitude. Every time he swiped a credit card to impress his wealthy wife, he was functionally tightening the chains around my neck. Dad, Trevor whispered, his voice cracking. The single word sounded small, frail, and deeply broken. Richard did not turn around. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, his head bowed toward the polished wood. The humiliation radiating from the back of the room compounded instantly. Jessica, who had insisted on accompanying her husband to Sacramento, sitting in the waiting area outside the conference room, was unaware of the impending disaster. But Trevor knew he would have to walk out those doors and explain the source of his wealth to a woman who valued financial status above all else. He would have to confess that her successful, independent husband was actually a fraud, supported by the impoverished sister they had routinely mocked at family gatherings. The pristine illusion was totally, completely obliterated. Diane broke the silence. The woman who treated her social reputation like a fragile glass sculpture finally collapsed under the weight of the undeniable evidence. She lifted her manicured hands and pressed them against her face. A harsh, ragged sob tore from her throat. It was not a performative cry designed to solicit sympathy. It was the visceral, agonizing sound of a narcissist realizing their carefully curated empire had burned to the ground, and the ashes were being cataloged by the federal government. She wept because the math was finally public, and it spared absolutely no one. Arthur Sterling closed the ledger and placed it back on the table. He did not offer a closing statement. He did not attempt to salvage the narrative. He possessed the experience to recognize when a legal defense was dead upon arrival. The federal prosecutor closed his leather portfolio. The government rests its preliminary findings, the prosecutor stated. We will forward the settlement requirements and the proposed plea agreements to your counsel, Mr. Sterling. The deposition concluded. The court reporter stopped typing. I stood up from my chair. I did not look at my parents. I did not look at my brother. I picked up my coat and my purse. I walked out of the sterile conference room, leaving the three of them sitting in the wreckage of their own design. The legal mechanics of the wire fraud, the tax evasion, and the forged documents were now fully exposed. The government possessed the irrefutable ledgers and the sworn testimonies. The prosecution phase would proceed swiftly and mercilessly. The quiet endurance of my 20s, the years spent living in a damp basement, tracking pennies and avoiding credit checks, had finally yielded a definitive verdict. I navigated the stainless steel elevator back to the ground floor of the federal building. I stepped out through the heavy glass doors onto the bustling streets of downtown Sacramento. The afternoon sun felt warm against my skin. The invisible war was officially over. The architects of the theft were trapped in a descending spiral of federal restitution and shattered familial bonds. The golden child was stripped of his unearned legacy, forced to confront the reality of his own fraudulent existence. The structural foundation of their opulence was crumbling rapidly. The conflict now shifted toward the final resolution. The legal system operates with cold, mechanical efficiency, extracting the necessary penalties and reallocating the stolen assets. I knew the consequences for Richard and Diane would be severe, involving massive financial liquidation and the total loss of their social standing. They were about to experience the exact same crushing poverty they had engineered for me. The scales of justice were preparing to deliver a brutal poetic symmetry, and the payoff would fundamentally rewrite the geography of my life. The federal justice system operates with a cold, mechanical rhythm. Once the Inspector General presented the comprehensive ledgers and the sworn testimonies, the prosecution moved with terrifying velocity. Richard and Diane faced a staggering barrage of indictments, including wire fraud, identity theft, and federal tax evasion. The sheer volume of undeniable paper evidence left them without a defensible legal strategy. The prospect of serving actual time in a federal penitentiary broke their remaining arrogant resolve. Arthur Sterling brokered a harsh plea agreement to keep his clients behind closed doors rather than iron bars. The terms of the deal required total asset forfeiture and crushing financial restitution. The penalties dismantled their curated lives instantly. Richard was terminated from his executive position the moment the charges became public. His corporate board severed all ties, citing the strict morality clause embedded in his contract. His unvested stock options dissolved. His reputation vaporized. The most satisfying casualty of the federal plea agreement involved the Placer County vacation home. The United States Marshals Service placed a heavy physical padlock on the oak front door of the waterfront cabin. The property was seized to satisfy the government debt. I read the subsequent asset liquidation report with a sense of profound closure. Before the house changed hands, government contractors stripped the interior to recover the stolen capital. They pried the custom Italian marble island up from the hardwood floorboards. The cold, polished stone, purchased with my blood plasma and my stolen credit, was dismantled and auctioned off in pieces to satisfy the Treasury Department. The monument to their vanity was sold for scrap. The resolution of my personal ledger occurred on a quiet Tuesday morning. I sat at my chipped desk in my basement apartment and logged into the loan servicer portal. For a decade, that specific website represented a digital prison. I clicked the account summary tab. The screen loaded. The fraudulent $85,000 principal was gone. The decade of compounded interest generated by their theft had vanished alongside it. The screen displayed a zero balance for the disputed accounts. A profound physical lightness washed over my chest. The suffocating pressure that dictated every choice I made since I was 18 evaporated. I closed the laptop. I breathed in the damp air of my apartment, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt safe. 48 hours later, my credit score spiked by over 150 points. I utilized my preserved savings and my newly liberated debt-to-income ratio to finalize the purchase of my sanctuary. I bought the 600-square-foot condominium on the industrial edge of the city. It was small, modest, and entirely my own. I painted the walls a warm, bright shade. I bought a new mattress. I set my small dining table for one. I changed the locks and did not distribute any spare keys. The fallout from the deposition extended far beyond Sacramento. Trevor returned to Southern California stripped of his unearned wealth and his protective parental shield. The reality of his financial incompetence became impossible to hide from his social circle. Jessica filed for divorce within 30 days of the federal proceedings. She was a woman who traded on status and affluent aesthetics. She possessed zero interest in remaining tethered to a man exposed as a financial dependent who subsidized his luxury life through his sister's forged signature. The divorce proceedings were public and humiliating. Trevor was forced to vacate the rooftop apartment and surrender the leased Jeep Wrangler. He lacked the high-level professional skills required to maintain his prior lifestyle. He had to secure an entry-level administrative job just to pay his basic living expenses. The pristine narrative he wore like a crown shattered, leaving him to navigate the harsh realities of the working class he used to ignore. The ultimate poetic justice arrived 6 months after the court finalized the plea agreement. Stripped of their liquid assets and drowning in mandatory government restitution, Richard and Diane could no longer afford the escalating property taxes on their suburban estate. The bank foreclosed on the home. They were forced to liquidate their designer furniture, their jewelry, and their imported vehicles. They had to downsize into a rental market they had not navigated in 40 years. The only property they could secure with their ruined credit histories and decimated income was a cramped, damp apartment on the lower level of an aging building. It featured peeling laminate floors, a sputtering refrigerator, and ground-level windows that looked out onto a concrete alleyway. It was the exact replica of the environment they forced me to endure throughout my 20s. On a cold, rainy Friday evening, my cell phone illuminated on my new kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed Diane's number. I had not blocked her new line. I accepted the call out of clinical curiosity. She was weeping. The dignified, stoic matriarch who used to view my struggles with cold disdain was sobbing uncontrollably into the receiver. "The basement flooded," she cried, her voice thin and desperate. "The heater is broken. We are surrounded by cardboard boxes, and the entire place smells like mildew. Richard cannot get the landlord on the phone. Sophia, please, I know you have a spare room in your new place. Just let us stay for a few weeks until we figure this out. We have nowhere else to go." I stood in my warm, brightly lit kitchen. I listened to the sound of her panic echoing through the phone. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer empty sympathy. I did not argue. "I will be right there," I said. I ended the call. I picked up my car keys and drove my aging Honda across town. The rain beat rhythmically against my cracked windshield. I parked on the street outside their new building. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a folded piece of fabric I had kept packed away in a storage box for years. I walked down the steep concrete steps into the subterranean stairwell. I knocked on the thin, hollow door. Diane opened it. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap, faded sweater. Her hair hung flat and unstyled. The apartment behind her was dark, cluttered, and freezing. She looked at me with desperate, hopeful eyes, anticipating a rescue. She expected the reliable scapegoat to step forward and absorb the burden one last time. I did not step inside. I stood on the concrete landing and held out my hand. I offered her the folded fabric. Diane looked down. It was the dark green apron I wore during my double shifts at the campus coffee shop. The heavy canvas was stained with stale espresso and years of grueling survival. It was the uniform I put on every morning at 4 o'clock because they told me my poverty was my own fault. She stared at the apron and then looked slowly up at my face. The hope in her eyes died, replaced by a cold, horrifying realization. "Welcome to the real world, Diane," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "Work harder." I turned around, walked up the concrete steps, and drove back to my sanctuary, leaving them exactly where they belonged. We are taught from our earliest moments of comprehension that the family unit is the ultimate sanctuary. In the traditional American ethos, the home is supposed to be the fortress we retreat to when the world outside becomes too harsh, too demanding, or too cold. It is meant to be the place where love is unconditional and safety is guaranteed. But what happens when the architects of that fortress are the ones quietly digging the trapdoors beneath your feet? The story of Sophia Jones, a young woman who discovered her parents had stolen her future to finance a luxury vacation home and subsidize her brother's opulent lifestyle, is more than just a modern cautionary tale about financial fraud. It is a devastating mirror held up to the darkest, unspoken corners of parenting and family responsibility. It forces us to strip away the glossy exterior of the American dream and ask a terrifying question. Are we raising our children to succeed, or are we grooming them to subsidize our own illusions? In contemporary American culture, there is an immense, crushing pressure to project the aesthetics of success. We frequently measure parental achievement by out-of-state tuition payments, pristine suburban lawns, and waterfront second homes. We have allowed the concept of providing for a family to become warped by consumerism, confusing the accumulation of luxury with the presence of love. Richard and Diane became so intoxicated by the performance of wealth that they entirely abandoned the fundamental, sacred duty of parenthood, which is protection. They viewed their daughter not as a vulnerable human being requiring long-term guidance, but as an unexploited line of credit. True family responsibility is not about maintaining a flawless public image. It is found in the quiet, unglamorous sacrifices made when no one is watching. It requires a baseline of absolute honesty. When parents prioritize their social standing over their child's tangible security, they do not just steal money. They strip away the child's fundamental right to trust the world. By forging Sophia's signature and intercepting her financial alerts, her parents taught her that the very individuals tasked with guiding her into adulthood were actually the predators she needed to be guided away from. The tragedy of the Jones family also masterfully exposes the catastrophic damage caused by the absence of fairness and emotional awareness within a household. Traditional family structures thrive on equity, but toxic environments often fracture children into rigidly assigned roles, pitting them against one another in a silent competition for resources and approval. We saw Trevor elevated to the status of the golden child, shielded from every hardship and bathed in unearned luxury. Sophia, conversely, was cast as the reliable scapegoat, systematically conditioned to believe her engineered poverty was a personal moral failure. This dynamic is a profound, generational betrayal of parental guidance. When you raise one child to believe they are automatically entitled to the harvest of another child's suffering, you destroy the potential of both. Trevor was left fundamentally crippled by his parents' deceit. He was a financial dependent disguised as a triumphant success story, lacking a resilience and the moral compass required to navigate the real world. When the illusion shattered, he was left with nothing, not even his marriage. Sophia, meanwhile, was forced to weaponize her own trauma, turning herself into an elite, meticulous auditor just to survive her 20s. Emotional awareness in parenting means recognizing that your children are not extensions of your ego. They are not props in your neighborhood theater, nor are they financial safety nets for your miscalculations. They are autonomous individuals who require equal honesty, equal grace, and equitable boundaries. Healthy, long-term guidance requires a parent to teach a child how to carry their own weight, not how to quietly strap their burdens onto the back of their sibling. Healing from this specific brand of invisible betrayal requires a monumental shifting of perspective. It requires the victim to unlearn decades of psychological conditioning. Sophia's greatest triumph was not merely walking away from the Tahoe cabin. It was recognizing that her exhaustion was not a symptom of her own inadequacy, but the intended result of their trap. If you are listening to this reflection and recognizing the faint, familiar echoes of your own childhood, if you have ever felt like your designated purpose in your family was simply to carry the heavy emotional or financial weight that others refuse to bear, you are not alone. These toxic dynamics thrive in silence. They hide behind manicured suburban lawns, forced smiles in family photographs, and tense holiday dinner tables. The only way to break the cycle is to drag these uncomfortable truths into the light. That is exactly what we are dedicated to doing here. If this story resonates with you, if you are currently navigating the complex, often painful journey of reclaiming your own identity from the people who were supposed to protect it, please take a moment to follow and subscribe to Elena Vengeance. Join our community in the comments section below. Share your own experiences, your victories, and your boundaries. We are building a secure space where the truth is never sacrificed for the sake of an uncomfortable peace. The green coffee shop apron that Sophia handed back to her mother in that damp, freezing basement was not merely an act of petty vengeance. It was the restoration of the natural order. It was the inevitable, unavoidable result of a parenting philosophy built entirely on deception and conditional affection. You cannot plant seeds of betrayal in the soil of your home and expect to harvest loyalty in your twilight years. The family unit is ultimately a ledger. It is a meticulous accounting system, not just of finances and property taxes, but of emotional debts and emotional deposits. Every lie told to a child, every manipulation disguised as a life lesson, and every sacrifice demanded without gratitude accrues a silent, invisible interest. And eventually, whether it takes months, years, or decades, the grace period always expires. The debt always comes due. As you look at your own family dynamic, at the roles you were assigned, and the silent sacrifices that are continually demanded of you, it is worth examining the true foundation of your sanctuary. Are the bonds holding your family together forged from genuine honesty, mutual respect, and emotional awareness? Or are they held together solely by the quiet, miserable endurance of someone who has simply been conditioned never to ask for their fair share? When the lights go out, the guests leave, and the performance of the perfect American family ends, somebody is always paying the physical and psychological price for the illusion. The only question left to answer is, who is paying for yours?